Good evening and welcome. I'm Matt Jacobs, Director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service here at the University of Florida. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to our third event in the Sustainability to Practice series that we have been running this semester. The first two events have been wonderful, and I'm sure that we have another one this evening that will add to the value that the first two have provided. I want to begin by thanking our co-sponsors, the UF Office of Sustainability, the Thompson Earth System Institute, and the Florida Climate Institute, who have partnered with us on all three of these events. At the opening of the last event in this series, which focused on global health and climate change, I talked about the fierce urgency of now, drawing on a speech that Martin Luther King gave at a church in New York City in 1967. Making the case that the issues that we're confronting in terms of global health, the first event was on affordable housing. Tonight's event obviously is on resiliency. I was making the case that all of these demonstrate or require the fierce urgency of now for us as a community to begin to think seriously about them, to develop policies to impact them so that we can begin to manage these challenges as we move forward. Tonight's event will further that conversation and again, I think provide some valuable insights as we continue to discuss these issues. Again, I want to thank our sponsors. I'm going to turn it over to Hannah Uloa from UF's Office of Sustainability, who will be running the show from here forward, and she'll lay out the ground rules for participation and all of that. So Hannah, thank you very much for working with us on this again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jacobs. Thank you again to the Bob Graham Center for being such amazing partners in this, and thank you also to the Florida Climate Institute and the UF Thompson Earth Systems Institute for their help in making this series come to life. I am really looking forward to the next piece in this series. I want to thank everyone who's been following along at the previous two panels and who's also joining us possibly for the first time tonight. We really appreciate your involvement in this and interest in learning more. This series has been grounded in the ways that climate change is exposing systemic issues and showing how those issues are interconnected. And tonight we're going to dive into community resilience, which doesn't just focus on things like infrastructure and sea level rise, but it's also talking about the power of social networks and the power of social support. And I'm really excited for this panel and all the expertise that they're bringing to this. I want to acknowledge that, unfortunately, one of our panelists, Lolita Jackson, had to drop out at the last minute for a medical emergency. She is currently the Director of Communications and Sustainable Cities with Sustainable Development Capital, and previously worked for over 15 years with the New York City Mayor's Office on Climate Policy and Resilience and Recovery. So we're really sad to not have her voice here tonight, but I'm still sure that we're going to have an amazing conversation. Our moderator tonight is Jason Von Medding, Dr. Von Medding. He is currently an associate professor at UF at the Rinker School and is a founding member of the Florida Institute for the Built Environment Resilience, or the FIBER Institute. He's a researcher, educator, and communicator in disaster studies, and his work focuses on how injustice and inequality are fundamental drivers of risk, especially when it comes to climate change. And I'm really thrilled to have his expertise brought to the table here, as well as the rest of our panel. I'll pass it off in just a second to Jason, and I just want to remind everyone to use the Q&A function for your questions. You can go ahead and start submitting questions as early as the opening statements. We're happy to have your questions rolling in throughout the event, but please use the Q&A function where you can also upvote questions as they come in. With that, we'll pass it on to Dr. Von Medding to take it away.
Okay, thank you, Hannah, so much. Hopefully you can all see and hear me. I'm so privileged to be invited to facilitate this panel on climate change and community resilience. I'm so glad that you could all join us this evening. Thank you to the organizers for imagining such a theme and for all of your ongoing work to come alongside communities in Florida and beyond to build sustainability, justice, and equity. But this evening, we're talking about community resilience. And the words community and resilience are both deployed in a variety of ways, as I'm sure many of you on this call will recognize. And so in relation to disaster and risk in society, community resilience is generally studied as a measure of the sustainability of a community to utilize the resources they have available to respond to external threats and adverse situations. So the positioning of community resilience is generally relative to external threats. And there are critiques of this approach to risk that centers on building resilience. And we often talk about building resilience among the vulnerable, so-called vulnerable, or on marginalized communities. And there's a danger that we might label people that, label the vulnerable as people that lack something, like they lack resources, they face hardships, they're located at the margin of society and need our help. Right? And this can be a really disempowering sort of frame. If we frame risk like this, then responsibility is placed right onto the victim to build resilience. And there's a danger that we might frame the negative outcomes that they experience as deficiencies or lack at the level of the individual, and fail to challenge the oppressive systems and structures that inflict violence on them. And I like how Roberto Barrios, who's a disaster anthropologist, critiqued this idea that communities and individuals just need to become more resilient. He said that this is a discourse that is intended to legitimize a risk-producing political economy. So it's a kind of discourse that can be used to legitimize the status quo. So my point here, just as part of an introduction, is that we need to approach this discussion of community resilience critically, and to make sure that injustice and inequality are foregrounded in our analysis of community resilience. And with the mounting impacts of climate change that are in front of us, we need to have these discussions really urgently. And so a few words about the format this evening. I'm really excited to share space with our guest today, and we're really sorry that Lolita cannot be with us, and we hope she recovers swiftly. But I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Marjorie Prakash, who is an experimental psychologist and currently a postdoctoral associate at the UF Disasters Trust and Social Change Lab, to join me today. And I'm also excited to speak with Lindsay Kalman, who's co-founder and executive director for Community Spring Gainesville. She's a public health specialist and social justice organizer. So thank you both for being with us, Marjorie and Lindsay. I'm going to, first of all, invite the panelists to share some initial thoughts by way of positioning themselves in this discussion. And from there on, we're going to break the discussion into two different sections. First, we're going to talk or unpack the idea of community resilience. And then secondly, we're going to talk about strategies for building resilience in communities. And we're going to finish with final thoughts from the panelists. And the way that we would like to run this is that instead of a Q&A section at the end, I'd love if you could all participate by way of the Q&A tab and share your questions right there so that we can integrate them into our discussion as we go along. Hopefully that's okay with everybody. So again, thank you all for joining us, and we will get started. So first of all, Marjorie, I want to come over to you. So Marjorie, you are an experimental psychologist at UF in the Disasters Trust and Social Change Lab. And I was wondering if we could start off by hearing a bit about your expertise and how you approach researching community resilience.
Sure. So let me preface this by defining what an experimental psychologist is. So I'm somebody who I classify myself as an experimental social psychologist. So what I'm really interested in is looking at the interaction between individual people and their environments. And so I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not licensed to treat people or work with people on an individual level. But what I do is conduct research about the population at large. And so how people in the population at large are impacted. And so when resilience, I'm looking at it from that angle. And so a lot of my training is in threat perception. So the idea about how our environments and the threats in our environments shape our psychology. And so I've focused specifically on how they shape sort of our risk perception, our time perception, and the decisions that we make when we're under these sort of ambiguous situations where we might be at risk, we might not, we're not entirely sure. And I've also looked at how these sorts of decisions and threats shape our health as well. And so when I talk about the sorts of environments that we interact with that might be relevant to thinking about resilience in communities, I'm really interested in how marginalization, erasure of certain groups, and things like spatial injustice might impact people's decision-making under threat.
Thank you so much, Marjorie, for that positioning and explanation of where you're coming from. I think it's a great place to begin. And I want to come to you now, Lindsay. Thank you so much for being with us. And maybe as a community-based organizer and public health expert, you could just explain to us how you view community resilience and how does your understanding of that concept inform your practice?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you all for, I'm not an academic, so I'm just thrilled that people want to hear what I have to say. So my background is really more in anti-poverty work from the economic resilience perspective, which I think fits nicely in this conversation around climate change. So I founded Community Spring. Community Spring is an anti-poverty organization that hires people impacted by poverty to organize around whatever issue they feel contributes most to structural causes of poverty. As we know, poverty is a really intersectional issue, so how we come at it should really be informed by the people experiencing it. And so that's what we do. We hire people to build out campaigns to dismantle structural poverty based on their lived experience. So then how community resilience plays in to my work is really at the core of it in a lot of ways. The pillars of our work are income and power, and you need both to dismantle structural poverty. People need income in order to build economic resilience. They need power in order to reshape the structures that keep them down. And so when we think about resilience on an individual level, I think that's probably a good place to start in terms of my work and experience. We think about what are the economic shocks that play out in everyday life. So that could be a car accident, that could be a sick kid, that could be a broken appliance. These are all, I think we can all agree that these are all just like normal life things. And if you've experienced normal life things and never thought about your ability to pay for them, then you probably have strong economic resilience. I think, for me, for example, if my car broke down, then I'd be able to call a tow truck, tow it to a place to get it repaired, probably put the bill on my credit card. And maybe that means I need to be frugal in the future in order to pay off a credit card. But in the end of the day, like this is a really manageable experience for me. It's not great, but manageable. So the flip side of that is, let's say I am single, I have a job that pays minimum wage, and I have 2 kids, and my car breaks down. So this is like a whole different scenario. I don't have access to a credit card because my credit score is low. So that means I can't upfront that cost. So now I don't have a car. So that means I now take the bus to work. So if I take the bus to work, that means that I can't pick up my kids when they are done with school. So I can't pick up my kids when they're done with school. And I decide to take that risk and allow them to walk home. And now the bus driver is noticing that my kids are being unattended. She calls DCF, and now I have DCF knocking on my door saying, why aren't you taking care of your kids? And now I'm in panic because that is the most important thing to me, is that I'm able to provide for them and take care of them. And so I have to take off of work to deal with this mess with DCF, and then I lose my job. And as you can see with all of these events, the hole gets deeper and deeper. and the safety net just isn't there. And when I'm going through that, I don't know where the hole is going to end, right? And this is also a really crisis-inducing experience. And so when we think about community resilience, it is likely that the people around me and my community have a similar experience. And so, for example, now Lindsay's talking, if I have a sick kid, I call my mom and I don't have to take off work that day and she takes care of him. Great, problem solved. If I either don't have a parent or do have a parent who also is dealing with crises and isn't able to take care of my kid, now I have to take a day off. Now I don't have additional sick time, and you can see how these things sort of perpetuate in community. So those are sort of like really life level everyday things. And the reason why I wanted to use that as an example to sort of kick us off is because these are the examples of resilience that occur in our communities in everyday life. And when we think about larger crises like climate change ones or COVID-19 or, you name it, we're really talking about magnifying that. So anyways, I want to leave it there. But that's sort of how I want to frame things here.
Thanks, Lindsay. I really love that, that framing. And it's something that, as a disaster researcher, I talk about a lot with my peers, is the everyday nature of risk and how risk is created within society. And we often don't recognize it until a so-called disaster event occurs. But the reality is that many people are facing risk every day that goes unrecognized. And I wanted to stay with you, Lindsay, and just ask you about the way that many people in society, if they fail to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, they're seen as lacking something or being a failure or irresponsible. And do you think that there's some sort of norm within our culture to blame oppressed people for their situation and expect them to do the labor to fix it?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question. And there's so many ways to think about that concept. And I kind of want to go back to the digging the hole metaphor, if you will, because resiliency is our ability to bounce back. And so I know as a white person from a middle-class family who has a salaried job with a spouse who also has a job, like my hole will just never get that big. And I have confidence in that. And that confidence allows me to thrive. And that is because I have strong resilience. And I think that when you talk about sort of like something that's lacking, like none of those things I mentioned have anything to do with how hard I work, right? They have nothing to do with my resourcefulness. They have nothing to do with my strength of character, my integrity, all of the things that you want to, talk about with, how we associate with poverty, like none of them, right? They would just happen to be the world and life I was born into. And that contributes to my resilience. And so when I think about resilience as a justice issue, the world I want to see is one where we know that hole will never get deep, right? Like life is always going to be ups and downs, but I want to make sure that no one's falling off a cliff into a void that is unknown. And so in terms of like what you're talking about with these associations with failure or not being able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but like, what if they don't have any boots, And so it's really strongly with a project that Community Spring will be launching in October, which is a guaranteed income pilot. So guaranteed income is really, for those of you who aren't familiar with sort of conversations around UBI and guaranteed income, it's an income floor. It's saying that nobody under a certain level should go below this level of income. And we're piloting that concept here in Gainesville starting in October, which is really exciting because what we're testing, it's a randomized control trial. And what we're testing is when you give people money on a monthly basis, how does that change their resilience? How does that change their ability to stabilize their lives that allows them to thrive? And so I'm really excited about this, and it feels like such an important tool to combat resilience because these things compound themselves. And I think as the hole gets deeper, the tools that we use to get people out need to be more robust so that we're on a more equal playing field.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lindsay, for that answer. And I wanted to, I think a related question came in from Serena that I wanted to address in the Q&A. And she said, we used to call car crashes accidents. Experts now call them crashes, underline that they can be prevented and are not random. How can we update our conversation about resilience and climate change to stretch beyond disasters? And I think this relates to what we're talking about, which is everyday risk and precarity, right? And indeed vulnerability as part of our humanity. Like we're born into a certain vulnerability, right? As by virtue of being human. But that doesn't mean that we should have violence inflicted on us, right? And so I think that's a good parallel with the car crash example. When we talk about disasters, they're often framed as something that's natural, and they're framed as something that is going to happen because there's a hurricane or there's an earthquake. But the reality is that most people that are impacted and killed in disasters are those who are structurally oppressed in society. Of course, there's the exceptions to that, right? But the reality is that most of the impact of disasters can be prevented, but we have designed a society and we continue to perpetuate a society in which certain people are impacted extremely disproportionately. So yeah, thank you for that question, Serena. I think it's really poignant. And we need to recognize the everyday nature of precarity. So Marjorie, I want to come to you and just talk a little bit about like your work in recent work looking at disasters and trust, and recognizing that we live in a very divided society. Our society is characterized by different social and political divisions. And so many people have lost a sense of trust in each other. But beyond the interpersonal divisions, we know that a lot of people have a low level of trust in state or non-state actors who are attempting to build resilience. And I just wanted to ask you, like, where do you think that stems from? Do you think people have legitimate reasons not to trust actors who are trying to help them to build resilience?
Sure. I love this question, Jason. Thank you for asking it. So one thing that I think is interesting in the research realm is a really hot question that people keep asking is, how is the news media that we're consuming shaping our trust? And so a lot of researchers like to act like, this mistrust that we're seeing in institutions that's been growing in recent years is this new phenomenon. It's being shaped by Russian bots, social media, misinformation sharing, and that this is leading people not to trust institutions. But what I think is often ignored in this conversation is that in order for these sorts of things to be shared and become like social media wildfire, people have to already have a sort of pre-existing level of mistrust in institutions, right? And I think speaking at least in a sense of like science history, there's plenty of reason to understand why people, especially some groups, may have mistrust in larger institutions. So speaking from a history of scientific research, biomedical research especially, there have been several really key studies within the last century, so relatively recently, in which human rights have been greatly violated. So for example, in the Tuskegee study, they examined a group of Black men who were infected with syphilis. And even after a treatment had been known for syphilis that they could use to treat these men, they allowed these men to suffer from syphilis untreated in order to continue to examine the progression of the disease. And so you see time and again that there are histories of these studies that are disproportionately mistreating communities of color, poorer communities, and also other marginalized communities that I haven't mentioned here. And so given this sort of history, it's actually not that surprising that, when you look at interviewing communities of color, that there's mistrust, right, in participating in scientific research, mistrust in going in for medical treatment when you consider these things in the broader context, right? And even today, there are some pretty staggering numbers that suggest that that medical outcomes and other sort of important outcomes are divided by things like race and ethnicity. And so I don't think that this mistrust is necessarily misplaced. There's definitely a historical context that has shaped this mistrust in institutions. And so putting it more in terms of disasters, on a built environment scale, we have a long history of marginalizing communities through practices like redlining when we're developing communities, disproportionately allocating resources when preparing communities for disasters, right? And so people who are on the short end of these sort of resource giving sticks have every reason to realize that they've been mistreated and to not trust these institutions that are making these decisions about where to allocate resources, right? And so at this point, it really shouldn't be completely on community members to have to learn to trust these larger institutions, right? The onus should be on scientific, government, and industry actors to build more transparency into what they're doing and engage community members more directly moving forward when we're working on issues like preventing climate change and mitigating disaster risk, right?
Absolutely. Thanks, Margie, for that response. And I wonder, Lindsay, if you could respond to Fiona's question in the Q&A, which I think is related, around what you're seeing at a community level in terms of gaps in community resilience in Gainesville, and what kind of policy could possibly establish accessible safety nets.
Yes, great. Thank you, Fiona. This is a great question. And there's so many ways to answer this too, because let's see. I think that one of the things I wanted to talk about here, because this is a great entry point, is I was struck by Marjorie's conversation about trust and how stigma and the question you asked earlier about stigma, and how when there is stigma and distrust on both sides, then, and especially with regards to people in power towards people experiencing poverty, then the biggest gaps are the ones that are not talked about and advocated for because no one's listening. And I think that it is the mistrust, especially in our political system and our institutions, comes from the fact that they're not serving underserved people. And so then the incentive to engage in them is small because they're not listening anyways, which is true. And so I had this conversation yesterday about voting and voting engagement and the importance for voting, but also why should I vote when the people I'm voting for aren't listening? And the answer to that is, yeah, that's true. Often not, and so, but we got to start somewhere, and that somewhere is engagement. And I think what causes those gaps in the safety net, and when I say gaps, I mean, just to like throw out a smattering of examples. I talked about economic gaps. That's the one that's most important to me, but also just like the digital divide, right? Like the gaps in access to technology just furthers furthers the resilience issue to begin with. You don't have access to computers, internet, smartphones. I mean, this is the world that we live in. And if you don't have access to those, then that's not setting you up for success, right? And but those are conversations that aren't really happening at the policy level, especially locally, because the people in those positions don't have that lived experience. Not that they're bad people by any means. It's just, that's not your lived experience. It's not the world that you live in. And that's aren't the things that you're thinking about. And so like an example that I would give too is, how locally our CARES dollars in the first round of CARES Act funding, we only, you had to prove loss of income, which I get, that's people who are losing their jobs or going down in hours. That's a significant population that we need to target with that support. But what about people who didn't have a job to begin with and are looking, they're unemployed. And so now they're looking for a job and they definitely don't have access to that employment because those jobs are gone. And now they also don't have access to CARES support, which you can see is just sort of an oversight in that population. And so that's a long way of saying that engaging impacted people just needs to be at the core of this, of any solutions to resilience, of any disaster mitigation. People impacted, the people closest to the problems are the people closest to the solutions. And not only do they need to be engaged in the conversations in order to identify those gaps, they also need to be engaged in how to solve them and then solving them every step along the way.
Absolutely. So it's about how you're engaged as well. It needs to be an engagement of mutual respect rather than something that's paternalistic. So I think there's a bigger issue about how do institutions engage with communities that they are supposedly helping, right? Something that came to mind was some of the stories that are on your organization's website that were speaking to some of these issues, and I just encourage anybody who's watching to go on there and read some of the stories on there, which are amazing. And there's a question from Jennifer in the Q&A who was asking specifically about your programs and asking what sort of time frame are you looking at in terms of improving resilience?
Ooh, that is a hard question to answer because that depends on how you measure resilience. And, I think that you can measure that so our metrics for success for Community Spring are more grounded in the fellows and the people that we hire than they are in large macro shifts in resilience, in part because our theory of change says that we need to be engaging people in community impacted by these issues, equip them with the tools to solve them, and then send them out into the universe to then, sustain that work, which with this pilot group is so far wildly successful. All of them have just really taken the reins and are true leaders in community and tackling some of the big problems, and will continue to tackle after the fellowship is over. So so we measure that in their individual resilience with the hope that that ripples out into community, with the understanding that it will ripple out into community. And so the way that we measure success with them as individuals more has to do with indicators for stability and well-being. So that includes, economic stability, as well as feelings of community. We have a survey tool that we give them at the beginning, middle, and end of the fellowship that look at sense of belonging. And then we also have some qualitative indicators too that look at that. So our results are in them as leaders in the hope that it ripples out. And actually, since I have the mic, I thought of something else I wanted to add related to Fiona's question about the biggest gaps in Gainesville and how to improve safety nets. And when we're talking about trust, and especially in light of the guaranteed income project that we're getting ready to launch, I think that one thing that I hope to see more and that I task all of you with is thinking about and educating people about critically thinking about the stereotypes and mistrust of people experiencing poverty, because when our general public has mistrust of people that have limited resources, then what that translates to is policies that also don't trust them. So one of the things that is really revolutionary about guaranteed income is the fact that we're giving people money with no strings attached. And that is, like, when you think about it in the abstract, hilarious that is revolutionary, because the solution to poverty is money, like, duh. And yet this is a crazy idea that you're giving people money because they can't be trusted, right? Because that's the subtext of all of this is you can't get people money. They can't be trusted with it because, look, they're already poor, so they're just going to keep being poor. And for some people that might be true. I'm not, ignorant to that. But I think for most people, they want stability in their lives. And I think in general, I would like to see the public trust people. And so when we increase safety nets, that really is a statement of, because everyone is deserving to have their basic needs met, period. And regardless of circumstance. And when we look at our policies now and how discriminatory they are, that those are results of the mistrust and the hostile environment towards people experiencing poverty.
Yeah, absolutely. And related to this is a question that came in from Samuel that I want to pose to you, Marjorie. Following on this thread about trust. And Samuel is just asking between trust in government or establishments or trust in other members of a community, which is more essential to a resilient community.
Sure. I think fundamentally just having trust in other people is important because, sort of echoing what Lindsay says, when you focus on people's well-being and trust at the individual level, it does tend to have a ripple effect, not only across communities, but across institutions as well. If you build community members that trust each other and think the best of one another, they will go on to elect those members into larger institutions, right, and build institutions that are more trusting. So I guess, at least selfishly speaking, since I research things at the individual level, I'd be more interested in looking at interpersonal trust among community members, because I think that that's a good starting point for measuring trust in more specific institutions as well.
Yeah, for sure. I personally would say that at an individual level is where we really build solidarity between and tapping into our shared vulnerability, our shared precarity. And for sure, a lot of us have lived lives of extreme privilege, but when we label others as vulnerable, part of that is our fear of not wanting to be them, right? And we need to be willing to step out, get into that situation alongside people and work with them. Because I think part of this whole conversation is the fact that a lot of building resilience is done by external actors to communities, as a form of help, right? And that's just going to perpetuate the same conditions generally. But if you can get in there alongside people and work with communities on using strategies that they have designed and according to what they want to do, that's something really powerful, I think.
Sorry, something I wanted to add on to your point.
Yes, please.
Is that we're a fundamentally social species, and the connections that we have with other people are not only something that's a boon to health, but they're vital just to the foundations of our health. So one of the leading causes of body inflammation, body damage, and chronic diseases related to aging is having, these more isolated, loose connections with other people, right? And so having this fundamental mistrust in other members of your community and feeling like you don't belong, like you're not valued, like you can't predict what other people are going to do. Will it be helpful? Will it be harmful to you? These sorts of things have very real implications for people's health, right? And so if you're able to sort of build these bonds at a small scale level, not only is it important for building better institutions, but it's better for building a healthier society as well. It's really fundamental to our psychology.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it makes me think as well about like the way that we are so critical of the decisions that people make without really understanding the oppression that they face and maybe the lack of opportunities and access. And so, like, what can we learn from psychology research to inform the way that we see decision making? I know we've talked before about risk tolerance and the risks that people accept because they have more pressing daily needs, right? So maybe you could speak a bit to that, Marjorie.
Sure. So to speak on this a little bit, let me start with telling you a little bit about our stress system, because I'm primarily interested in how we perceive and react to threats. And so disasters, climate change would fall under this veil. Our stress system tends to be really, really well tuned to helping us deal with short-term threats. So, think about the fight or flight that you hear about in cartoons and other things like that, where, you are walking through the woods, you encounter a bear, you bristle up, your adrenaline runs wild, and then you run, right? We tend to be very well tuned towards handling those sorts of threats. More chronic threats like facing, continued poverty, continued instability, these digging a deeper hole, as Lindsay mentioned, we're not so well tuned adrenocortically speaking, so like our stress response system to these longer, more chronic threats. And so one thing that the research finds is that when you expose people to sort of these chronic levels of threat, what you tend to see is that people prioritize the smaller decisions that they can do in the here and now. And so you can think of it as like putting out a series of fires. And so we tend to prioritize things like food, rent, utilities, the basic things we need to keep us alive. And that this often comes at the expense of, thinking about these longer term threats that could come back to haunt us. So not saving for retirement, not buying those hurricane shutters for next season, not buying that flood insurance, right? It's not really something that people tend to think about when they're worried about how they're going to pay their light bill this month, right? And so one of the reasons I'm really excited to hear, Lindsay, that you're bringing this universal basic income program is that some of the research I've read about, at least on a smaller scale, suggests that, removing some of these barriers of poverty really does change people's decision-making on a fundamental level. They did a study with rural farmers in India where they gave them sort of a smaller, more simplified version of a universal basic income, because these farmers tend to live about half the year in abject poverty and the other half of the year doing okay because they've sold their harvest. And they found that these farmers were saving more money. They were investing more in things that kept their farms more economically viable across the year. Once some of this poverty stress had been alleviated and people were able to think in the longer term. And so when you think about things like disaster risk and climate change, these are longer term problems, right? And so if you want to sort of mitigate risk for these problems, you have to start to think about ways to alleviate people's short-term threats, right? And so this is just a really roundabout way of sort of echoing what both of you have said, which is that we need systemic change. If you don't like the sorts of decisions people are making, you need to change the environment, because what people are doing when placed under these situations of chronic stress is perfectly logical, right? Even if it seems irrational to others at face value.
I can't agree more with everything you just said. And I'm gonna, Jason just mentioned earlier our blog where our fellows write stories on different topic areas and how their life has intersected with these issues. And I'm gonna put in the chat right now a link to it because the most recent one, so it's the first one that pops up, is on UBI. And the fellow who wrote it talks a lot and thinks a lot about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Which is really what you're referring to, is this idea that we need to satisfy basic needs first, and then we can get to sort of long-term planning and self-esteem and well-being and these bigger picture long-term issues. And I think that really speaks to what you're saying. And the way that I see it a lot in our work when there's not a disaster is like health insurance is a great example of that. Of the health insurance is sort of like something that everyone should have, but also it's not a problem until it's a problem. So I'm gonna keep putting it off until there's a disaster, but now I'm in $50,000 worth of debt because I broke my leg and had to have an MRI and, don't have insurance or whatever. And so that's a good example of, how mitigating risk and things like insurance that require long-term thinking. But if you're constantly putting out fires, then thinking about insurance, retirement, even, stable employment or progressing in your career. One of the things that came out of the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration, which was the first guaranteed income pilot that they just recently have empirical results from, 2 weeks ago, the study came out. What they saw is that people, compared to the control group, people with a guaranteed income are more likely to have sustained full-time employment. Twice, they're double likely than the controls. And that's not because of incentives or what, it's really because of stability, because they can think in long-term ways and plan accordingly. And as it relates to climate change, get those hurricane shutters that you mentioned.
Yeah, no, to speak to stability, that's actually a really, really interesting point that you bring up. So my lab that I was in graduate school did a lot of work with health behavior, and we looked specifically at how early childhood experiences of social unpredictability and economic unpredictability shape decision-making in adulthood. And so the idea being that just like adults, children crave stability, and this is actually an especially vulnerable time in, I don't want to say vulnerable because Jason has redefined it in a much better way than I'm using it right now. But that early childhood is really a critical time in which we sort of develop our worldview and our expectations of the kind of world that we'll be dealing with for the rest of our life. And so what they find is that children who grow up in environments marked by not only poverty, but more importantly, instability, seem to calibrate things like eating behavior to survival rather than the current environment. So when I say this, I mean things like they tend to eat whenever food is available rather than eating when they're hungry versus not, because they're getting cues from their environment that, I don't know when my next meal is going to come. So it makes sense for me to just eat whenever food is around, even if I'm not hungry, because it's important to build up caloric reserves for this uncertain future. And so you can take this sort of behavior in the health domain and apply it to other decision-making domains as well, right? And so if you're teaching people early on or placing them in these long-term situations marked by instability, people are going to start to sort of overindulge in the present, right? And do things to sort of, trying to think about the best way to say this, survive based on that. And so it's sort of interesting that you mentioned that, because again and again, the one variable that seems to pop out in my old lab's research is instability, even more so than poverty itself.
We can move forward, but I have this topic is just so poignant for me. I think one of the things that also comes to mind is the Marshmallow Study, right? Where if you can delay gratification, so as a child, there's a marshmallow in front of you, and the researcher says, if you wait and eat this until I come back into the room, you can have 2 marshmallows. And the first iteration of the study showed that kids who could delay gratification and wait for the researcher to come back in and get the second marshmallow had longer term success indicators later in their life. And so the conclusion of the study is delayed gratification is important and planning ahead, blah, blah, blah. The second iteration of the study disaggregated children by stability and income level of the same children, and discovered that the delayed gratification piece was more about exactly what you just said, that if I'm a kid and I don't trust that there's actually going to be a second marshmallow because of the instability of my life, like I'm going to eat the first one because I don't actually think the researcher's going to come back in and give me a second one. And that has nothing to do with my ability to delay gratification and everything to do with the environmental indicators that perpetuate these cycles of poverty, right? So anyways, just wanted to throw that out there.
No, I love that you're speaking my language. These things even embed themselves on a cellular level. We've done some work in my lab where we've drawn people's blood and looked at cellular indicators of inflammation, so like our body response to being sick, and find that people who are in these sort of chronically unstable, stressful environments, they tend to have body cues of this stress damage that accumulates over time, and that is linked to, like you said, not wanting to wait for the marshmallow, right? Because even your body is cueing to you that things are not certain for the future. And so, yeah, even in adults, you find that these chronic environments of instability really like work their way into your skin and into your decision making in very subtle ways. But these can have very meaningful impacts on decision making over time, right? So small effects, but big effects over time.
I love where this is going, and I think it's going to open up lots more questions that we need to continue in the future. But I want to bring in some of the audience questions into the next section, where we have about 25 minutes left. So I want to talk about strategies for building resilience, and maybe give some people some ideas to take away and implement into their research or practice or their daily lives. And so I saw a few questions. Hannah was asking about embedding resilience concepts into policy. Serena was mentioning that we are all vulnerable to climate change. And that kind of speaks to some of the way that resources are inequitably distributed, which generate this discriminatory impacts that we see, not only under climate change conditions, but under everyday risk as well. And then Pilar Morales says was asking about the importance of place-based experiences and knowledge for understanding resilience, just drawing our attention to the fact that a lot of these things need to be discussed in a very context-specific way, right? And so maybe, Lindsay, I can come to you and just ask about, like, how do we bring together an analysis that recognizes geographical difference, but also like keeps the focus on the systems that generate inequality and injustice, which are part of they're the things that we choose, like collectively, as humans, as societies. And so how do we work at that level to devise better systems, and at a more local level, programs and policies to encourage community resilience?
Great. Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think that you know, I want to sort of echo something I previously said about engaging impacted people, where the importance of sort of not making assumptions about people's lives and instead engaging impacted people. And so in terms of, you know, the sort of the grassroots responses, that's why it's important that we sort of, I hate to use bottom up instead of top down, but I'm going to, where, you know, our decision making should be sort of bottom up instead of top down, where like we're engaging community, and then that builds policy, and then that policy on a larger level then impacts a lot of people. And one of the ways I'm seeing that play out in Gainesville right now in a really cool way, that in terms of ways to get involved, I encourage you all to look into, is right now the city of Gainesville is undergoing their comprehensive plan, which is something that happens every 10 years. And it's a really big deal because it affects housing, it affects food access, it affects education, it affects community resilience. And I really appreciate one of the things that the city is doing differently this time is they have hired a group of what they're calling community connectors, which is a group of people who are in community, going out, educating people about the comp plan, why it's important. They're holding listening sessions, they're doing seminars, and it's hard because the comprehensive plan is like a really technical, bureaucratic, jargony type policy, but it's really important. And it's so important that impacted people are a part of it, and how to sort of translate that is tough. And that is like, but that is something that in terms of sort of being regionally specific, it should be neighborhood specific. I mean, it should be street specific, like, you know, this, how we get into the granular engagement is important, because if you just have people on the northwest side of town engaging in the comp plan, it is only going to serve the people on the northwest side of town.
Yeah, that's totally true. I guess the message is that people need to, I guess, step outside of their comfort zones and find people that are maybe not like them, and show mutual respect, and value and promote voices that are underprivileged in our society, to get a better picture of what we actually need, because we have our perspective from our position of what we need, but often we don't even recognize or much less understand the needs and aspirations and experience of people outside of our neighborhood, or our kind of bubble that we live within, our bubble of privilege. So Marjorie, I want to come to you just about that idea of risk perception, because like perception of risk looks very different depending on your experiences and your position in society. And so why does this happen? Like from your point of view as someone who studies the way people think and the way their brains work, why do people perceive risk so differently? And how can we use that kind of knowledge about the way that people perceive risk to develop inclusive and responsive programs, in our societies at whatever level?
Sure. So I apologize in advance for an overly broad answer here, but this is sort of a complicated question. There's a lot of factors that play into people's risk perceptions, right? So there's everything from genetics to differences in early environment, as I've mentioned before, how we learn across the lifespan, our current motivation, the competing stressors that we may be dealing with in our current, existence, kind of speaking to what Lindsay said about economic stressors and how those sometimes get in the way of other, decisions that we're trying to make. All these things are important when it comes to trying to predict and understand other people's perspective on risk, right? But I think of a special interest now, we should really be thinking about how we're really talking to other people about their opinions of risk. And so sort of to echo what you both have said, I think we need to find a way to make the research process more equitable, because it's going to make policymaking more equitable in the future. And so engaging in new research techniques like community-based participatory research, where we sit down with members of the community, and instead of coming up with our own hypotheses about how we think members of the community are going to perceive risk or think about a problem, we need to just sit down with them and ask what they think. What are the problems they're experiencing? What are they concerned about, right? Because I think, as speaking for myself as somebody from, a relatively stable background who is white, I may be thinking about different problems within Gainesville's community than somebody living in East Gainesville might be, right? And so unless we have a way to sort of build trust as researchers with communities and get them to members of these communities to tell us about their experiences, we're going to continue just imposing our own perspectives on other people, which sort of limits our knowledge about, their risk perceptions, right? And so I think we need to continue doing this sort of qualitative ground up research in combination with the research that we're already doing in order to have a better idea about this.
If you all are interested along those lines, Community Spring actually conducted a participatory action research project right when COVID hit. And the questions were developed by our fellows who are, people in the community, and we developed those questions based on sort of their preliminary, conversations with their neighbors, with their family, and sort of parse through like what are the challenge areas, how is COVID actually impacting our community. And so if you're interested in the results of that, they're on our website and our COVID campaign, tab. And, there were definitely things and then we presented that research to sort of different stakeholders in the community, city government, county government, but also like the Kiwanis Club and the Rotary Club and, like those types of groups. And it was really interesting sort of getting their reactions and things that like people didn't think about, like when we talked about the lack of access to cell phones and Wi-Fi, and the different groups we talked to were just like stunned that that was a thing. And it's so important to engage those people on how you're asking the questions and what you're asking.
Yeah, that's great to sort of add another anecdote to your story. I moved here last fall. I was living in New Orleans beforehand, and I was living in a neighborhood that's relatively low income, fairly Black. And what was interesting is during COVID, there were a lot of people throwing parties, going out, socializing, doing things that public health officials were wringing their hands over. And people were talking down about, these communities like the ones in my neighborhood. And what they didn't think about was that many people who lived in my neighborhood were frontline workers. And so they were already being forced to go out with relatively little personal protection and serve other people in light of COVID. And so people in my neighborhood already felt that they were at increased risk of getting sick, and figured that what's, throwing a party or going and getting support from my friends when I'm already at risk anyways. And, this is just another example of how, if you go in and you talk to the community, you can get a completely different perspective, because again, public health officials thought people were just being irresponsible. But when you think about it, it makes sense why members of those communities thought that there might not be really that much harm to going out and visiting their neighbor down the street, because they already felt, again, that they were at risk through their jobs. And so, if you're worried about people's socialization during off hours, you need to focus on increasing protection and vaccinations for frontline workers, right? And that's something that they wouldn't have known, if it wasn't for engaging with members of the community.
Yeah, I think this discussion of like, how do we engage and how could we ever know what people actually need or what the experience is without processes to listen, right? And to listen with respect and design responses in a way that demonstrates serious respect, because often it's just, a gesture. So, and I think we can link this to climate change as well. I know, Caroline, I saw your question in the box as well about environmental colonialism. And that also speaks to the way that we engage with communities that we are purporting to help, right? And I think if we think about like how disaster response usually happens, it usually reinforces power and dominance, and our policy that we maybe enact for planning or development or housing or whatever doesn't really deal with the systemic nature of the issues that people are facing. And so, like in light of that, and I know we're coming to a close now, but I want to ask you both for your final kind of thoughts and suggestions as to how people who are listening in here can actually take action on some of these issues, whether it's in their studies or careers or everyday lives. So maybe, Lindsay, I can come to you first.
So I think that probably the take-home action message to leave you all is, I alluded to sort of earlier on in the conversation, we are living in a culturally fascinating time where people are calling into question their perceptions in a way that is led to some really profound social change that I worry people will feel fatigue, and we're already seeing a lot of that fatigue happening. But the momentum around thinking critically about race, poverty, resilience, mental health, all of the things, housing, all the things that we're talking about before, what are our perceptions of people and how does that play into my daily life, my career, my research? And the answer is that they do, and we need to continue to question our assumptions. We need to continue to question our perceptions, and continue to ask these hard questions and have conversations with our family, friends, policymakers, professors. Like these are really important debates that we're having, that we're seeing nationally in a profound way, and we need to keep having them because the more we do, the more that will be reflected in your careers and your policies and how how this all plays out. But it won't happen if we continue to accept status quo, and it won't happen if we're not educating each other, enlightening each other, and listening.
Thanks, Lindsay. Maybe I can pose the same question to you, Marjorie.
Sure. Piggybacking a little bit off of what Lindsay has said, in addition to questioning your assumptions, I would challenge you to question the things that you're not assuming. So we have mental representations in our head of what we think a resilient society should look like, what we think healthy spaces should look like, right? And so, for example, there's some really fascinating research by Courtney Bonham about redevelopment, and it's sort of relevant to spatial justice, a subject that Jason holds near and dear. And that's when we think of middle class sort of nicer spaces, we often think of these spaces as being white. And so even when you present people with pictures of these really nice middle class neighborhoods that are predominantly Black, people tend to devalue these neighborhoods and think of them as being more dangerous and less middle class than they actually are. And this is off the basis of the idea that people have this sort of mental representation of wealth as being conflated with white. And so that's an intersectional question, right? And so it's something when we're thinking about our assumptions, we're ignoring the fact that you can be somebody who is, of a minority background and also be well-to-do. And, we have these sorts of prototypes in lots of other areas of our life. Like, what is our prototype of, a former prisoner? What is our prototype of a researcher, of a politician, right? And so some of these gaps in how we envision things also play into the types of decisions that we're making when we're thinking about what policies to advocate for. So I challenge you to try to relook at some of these assumptions you haven't made through an intersectional light as well. Think about groups that you may be leaving invisible when you're thinking about the future.
Yeah, thank you for that response. We have a few more minutes, and I saw this question come in that I thought, Lindsay, you might have a really interesting response to about, how we engage, how we get input from people who are experiencing these problems, because a lot of people who care are struggling themselves for their time poor, and Catherine was wondering if we have creative strategies. I thought you might be placed to respond to that.
Yes, and I love this question because it speaks to why we created Community Spring. And it, in my background in advocacy, I think, let's see, there's so many things that brought me to Community Spring and how we developed it. One was one day when I was working in an advocacy organization that was reproductive health and centered women of color, and most of the staff was white. And I think that there have been lots of examples in settings like that, where we are centering impacted people, but they also aren't the ones being hired for these positions that are, as professional advocacy change makers, however you want to say it. And that's not right. That's not how we want to do things. If we're going to authentically center impacted people, then they need to be the ones in my position. I shouldn't be in this job. I mean, I can be in this job, but I don't need to be. And the only reason that I am is because I had the opportunity for the education and I had the resilience. And so in terms of, to answer, that's a long way of answering your question, that, that's why we hire people. I feel like it is important to pay them for their time, because you're absolutely right. When you go to a city commission meeting, it's a lot of people who are retired, which is great. They need to be at the table too, but they shouldn't be the only ones at the table. And the reason that they are is because commission meetings happen during work hours, and sometimes they're hard to get to. Now they're virtual, so they're easier. And so the voices that are being heard are the people who have the privilege of being there. And that's super real. And so the way that we solved that is, and would encourage others to, is through employment and adequate compensation. And, I think that's not always that can't always be the case for everyone. And I totally understand that. But I think that Catherine's question is well taken, which is unfair to also put that burden on people who are burdened, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I love that answer. And I'm just looking through the questions. I want to hand back to you, Hannah. But I just want to thank Deborah for the interventions in there. I'm just reading your questions. And I'm totally agree that we need to, as those of us who are researchers, need to integrate much more creative and critical engagement strategies and kind of research, even like operate from different research paradigms that are more critical and that are focused on social change, because not all research paradigms have social change as part of their agenda, right? So I think those of us who are engaging in this type of work need to think about how we are doing how we are approaching the research fundamentally, if we're to achieve the sort of things that we are talking about. So I really appreciate all of the questions and coming in from the audience. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Marjorie and Lindsay, and I'll hand back to you, Hannah.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. I think you said it perfectly, and that in these conversations, there's clearly so many things that we can do in our lives, in our studies, in our research, and our jobs. But I really appreciate this conversation in thinking about these things critically. And I know personally, even just tonight, my perspective on things has shifted a little bit. And I really appreciate all of the panelists, Lindsay, Marjorie, Jason, all of you being here and bringing that critical thinking and that self-reflection element to this as well. It's really valuable. And I appreciate everyone that was able to join us tonight. And thank you for participating in the Q&A function so expertly. I know we didn't get to every question and I apologize, but we appreciate all of the engagement tonight. We will follow up with more information and a recording of this as well. Thank you for joining, and thank you again to the Bob Graham Center for being such great partners in this. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.